RugbyRenegade.com, the #1 online strength and conditioning program for rugby. Are you ready to get bigger, stronger, fitter, and faster and dominate your opposition? Welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast, where we build machines.
Hello and welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Pro Athlete Supplementation. Check them out at pas-nutrition.co.uk for all your supplementation needs. And don't forget that subscribers to the Rugby Renegade program get a 40% discount on retail prices. That's right, we are back with episode 35 of the Rugby Renegade Podcast. My name is Jimmy Bain, and today I have the great pleasure of interviewing a good friend of mine, Dan Tobin, Head of Performance at Gloucester Rugby. Of course, he's good friends. I worked with him for a year at Gloucester. Great time. Learned a lot from him, and I'm sure you will also learn a lot during this podcast. He holds nothing back. Gives away all of his secrets, and I'm sure you will learn plenty about rugby strength and conditioning and how it works in a professional environment. So, as always, give it a listen and let us know what you think. Hi Dan, welcome to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. Thanks for coming on. Why don't we start by you just telling us a bit about your background, how you got into strength and conditioning and some of the sports and teams you work with.
Hi Jamie, and thanks for having me on. My own background is I'm Irish, as you can probably tell, so I worked with Leinster Rugby for about 10 years through the academy and senior setup there, and came to Gloucester about 18 months ago as head of S&C here. Prior to that, then I went to college in Dublin City University, and then University College Dublin for masters after that. And my own sporting background was as a sprinter, really at that junior under 20 level. And I've done some work in Gaelic football, the Dublin football team back home too. So that's summary really of my background.
Yeah, cool. And so with your background in sprinting, what have you tried to take from that and apply in rugby?
Probably early on in my coaching career, probably a lot of it would have been around the use of just developing speed mechanics in team sport players really, and the use of plyometric training, power training, which would have been typical of what I would have done myself, and then probably noticed that it was an underused form of training in rugby. Certainly when I started, it was probably very much strength based and hypertrophy based training, so it was just including some more speed agility type work, plyometric type work early on with academy players in Leinster was probably something that I think I got a lot of value out of in terms of developing players back then, and I've probably taken that on into my career since then. But to be honest, a lot of it is in the early days I probably would have trained rugby players like sprinters in a lot of ways in terms of speed mechanics drills and everything else, but after a bit of time you realise that it's probably not very time efficient to do that, and you've got to pick and choose what things actually apply well to rugby. And there's no point in teaching a prop really good high-end top speed mechanics when time would be better spent developing other things with that type of player. So you learn that as you go through time, but it's some of it is applicable, but it got me on the road in the first couple of years in terms of having a little bit more knowledge on that, but then you've got to develop it and make it more specific to the sport that you work with really from there. Yeah,
definitely. And I always feel sorry for props because they're always the example in that case, aren't they? But so in terms of that, how do you kind of figure out what your athletes should work on as their kind of priority, as a physical priority?
Well, I suppose, as you know from Gloucester here, nowadays we would have performance standards for players by position, with some things being more important for some positions than others. So top speed is something that we would have a standard for our backs, say, but for type 5 players it's not something we'd be massively concerned about, but we're much more concerned about their relative strength in a squat and say their power output with high loads. And then with our backs we'd be much more interested in their reactive strength levels, their top speed levels. And I suppose from a speed point of view, then we would do more acceleration type work with across all positions, but would only really worry about top end speed levels with our backs and maybe some of our back rowers if that's their type of game. So yeah, we try and be position specific without getting too complicated on different performance markers, really.
Yeah, cool. And then in terms of that top speed for those back three players, backs, what's your kind of approach for improving speed in rugby?
A lot of it, I think, is dependent on the environment that you work with and the coach that you work with in terms of how much time you get to develop those qualities. So at the moment, we would have had a good speed exposure in pre-season in terms of actual standard speed sessions mixed with some skill work for our backs. And then in season, we do a lot of speed prep, speed mechanic type work in around our plyometric training or prep stuff before we go onto the field. And then we just make sure that we get good sprint exposure in the week. So at the start of a backs unit session, we might do 2 flat out efforts over somewhere between 30 and 50 meters, depending on the player and what they want to do or their position. And then we would track, say, over 80% of their top speed, how many efforts they have in that in a week, and then over 95% of the top speed is genuine efforts that should improve speed performance over time. And it's really, for us, it's about tracking that every week and making sure that we get a consistent exposure to it, so that, well, one, it doesn't become an injury risk when they do sprint if they haven't done a 95% effort in 2 or 3 weeks and then suddenly they get exposed in a game. That obviously is a risk factor, so we make sure that every 3 or 4 days that we get people as much as possible over 90-95% at top speed as a development tool for speed, but also as a trying to eliminate as much as possible that risk of high speed exposure for those guys.
Yeah, cool. So you're balancing the kind of loading they get from the actual training and like all things being equal, hopefully you get a lot of those speed stimulus from that, but then obviously topping them up if they need to, and if they need to increase speed.
Exactly,
as
well.
Yeah.
But it might be we don't have the luxury often of having a lot of time to take the players out and get them run over 30-40 meters, give them some feedback on their technical form, and then go again. It's more, let's make sure we get those exposures and do the best that we can in terms of getting some technical elements in elsewhere in the week. And then obviously when we get, so we've a couple of back three players now, with one with a finger injury, one with a shoulder injury, so that's a really good opportunity then to go into more traditional speed type efforts with them on their return to run protocols. We'll get 6 or 7 good quality speed sessions done with those guys where we can delve into the technical parts of it a bit more. And those 6 or 7 sessions then should stand them in good stead for quite a period of time afterwards when they're getting top up exposures in training like that. You would hope that they'll hold some of the technical things that you try to develop through that injury period. So it's literally adapting and trying to be smart in where you get it in when you can in the training week, really.
Yeah, it's just kind of picking your battles there, aren't you? And now
Exactly.
you mentioned your plyometrics, and you do it quite differently. I know you've done research into sort of complex training and things like that, and you've kind of gone away from that. Do you want to explain a little bit about that and how you sort of program in the jumps and things?
Yeah, again, it dates back to some of those early days when I was with the academy at Leinster, and from my own training experience, I used to use complex training a lot myself when I was running around, I suppose, the mid to late 90s. It was something that was consistently, there was research coming out at the time that saying that it was the way to train, and obviously a lot of the Eastern European, I suppose, practices would have been promoting complex training as a good form of training as well. So I used to get a little bit frustrated over times when players would stop developing kind of movement, jump height, or reactive strength in training, and I used to be able to get them to a certain point and then not go beyond it. So we started looking at just monitoring in our complex training sessions. We would do counter movement jump at the start of the session, then they'd squat, and before we do a plyometric exercise, we just do a counter movement jump as a monitor. So we looked at that like 2 minutes after the lift, 4 minutes after the lift, and found that in most cases actually the counter movement jump performance was down on baseline. So that formed the basis then of looking into it a little bit more, and that's what I did for my master's. So we looked at complex training, and that stuff isn't new in terms of showing I suppose a reduced performance 1, 3, 5 minutes after a heavy squat. But what we did do then was pretty much did the same thing with just I think it was 50, 60 plyo actions, plyometric jumps in a row, and we track counter movement jump. The research was 25 efforts, and we track counter movement jump 1, 3, and 5 minutes after those 25 efforts, and compared it to the baseline. And we found a really positive effect across that timeline. So basically what we found was that plyometric exercise has a potentiation effect on itself. So you do a repeated series of jumps, and it improves jump performance better than squatting and then going into jump did for us. So that became then the reason why we would do our, like you've seen, 50 to 70 jumps typically at the start of a lower limb session, and then go into our heavy loading after that, as opposed to mixing it in a complex fashion. And once we started doing that, we found that counter movement jump and reactive strength over a period of training, months and years, we were getting much better bang from our buck from that. So for that reason, I've kind of gone away from that complex format, because I think you probably need, and the research will support that, you probably need 8, 10, 12 minutes between the lift and the jump to optimize the potentiation effect. And you don't have that luxury of time. The session will go on 30 hours on end if you try to do that. So if you've got 45 to 60 minutes, we need to be efficient with time. So it takes us 5-10 minutes to get through our plyometric jumps, and then we go on and squat. And we've made consistent improvements in counter movement jump, reactive strength, and then you go on to your strength loading after that. So that's pretty much the summary of it. I've been doing it for a number of years now, and it's been quite successful. So
yeah, and the other thing, just like from watching the sessions, is that kind of initial part of the session where they're all doing the plyos together, it's real good vibe, and then they all go in and do the counter movement jump with everyone watching. It gets real competitive, and like that in itself probably has a big effect.
I do. It's an enjoyable form of training. People like jumping around because it's almost childlike, if you know what I mean, which is much more enjoyable than just putting 150, 160 kilos in a bar and squatting. It's not. It's just work,
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. I think it gives us huge value as well in terms of contributing to the speed end of it as well, where we know if we're developing reactive strength the whole time, counter movement jump the whole time, players are getting stronger. But then it's about getting some sort of technical component into your speed program as well, making sure that they get exposed to high speed efforts in the week, and all those factors together combine to hopefully gradually improve the speed performance of your players. And that's certainly what we found. The start of this season, probably we've seen a big shift in the speed of our backs, the top speed levels of our backs, which is due to the work that's gone on probably over the last few years in terms of developing all those qualities.
Yeah, definitely makes a lot of sense. And now we've already spoken about it quite a bit, but how would you kind of describe your S&C philosophy in a nutshell? It's probably a difficult one after what we spoke about.
I suppose for me, the key thing would be that your S&C program has to have a positive impact on rugby performance. So you could have an S&C program that improves all sorts of numbers within a gym setting that could have no actual outcome in terms of improving sporting performance. Mm-hmm. So I think you've always got to be linked to the way that the team wants to play and the values or principles that the rugby coach maybe has on what way they want to play the game. That has to filter into the way that you design your strength and conditioning program. So if you want to play a dynamic, fast type of game, that has to affect the way you train your players. If you want to play a slower set piece type game, but that has to affect the way you condition your players too. So for me, we always try and, like we did last year, link it back to the game. So why are we getting stronger? We're getting stronger so that we can be more powerful. Why are we getting more powerful? So that we can influence your ability to carry, your ability to win a breakdown, your ability to bust through a gap in defence or whatever else. So, and then we trying to map out for them in some sort of model that, when we do our ball carry stuff, technical stuff, we're just basically honing into the power capacity that you develop in the gym, and that's what's going to make us better collision winners in the field. So, to me, I always try and want to explain things a little bit to players so that they see the value in what they're doing beyond just sets and reps in a gym. The value of it is improving their performance on the field. And once they believe that, I think their motivation levels to commit well to the program improves, and then you see performance improving as a result of that. So that I don't know if that's an essence of philosophy, but that's more a philosophy on how to prepare a team, really. But
yeah, no, I definitely agree. Like if you relate it to rugby, I mean, there's some players that will they just chase gym numbers for fun anyway. But there's other boys who are there just for the rugby, and this, it's just kind of a tick box exercise for them. But if you relate it to the rugby for them, they get a lot more buy-in, and they'll get the results and then see it carry through. So it makes a lot of sense. Now let's talk a bit about exercise selection. I know you've over the years done a lot of research in different exercises for different physical capacities, and tried to figure out what are the kind of best ones. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and kind of what your findings are and why you've done that?
I suppose I wouldn't say we've done a lot of research, but it was more. I've always tried to split. Just always ask questions about why would we do that exercise and not this one? Why would you do this one and not that one? And for me, it's probably splitting up the qualities or the capacities that are different. So to me, max strength is a quality, or peak force, whatever you want to call it. Rate of force development then is a separate quality. Peak power is a separate quality. Reactive strength is a separate quality. So it's just making sure that, I suppose originally I would have looked at it and gone, well, what's the best exercise for developing those different qualities? So, for example, we looked at, we did some more in-house stuff, and some of it was published, I think, but it was more looking at an Olympic lift, say, versus a hex bar jump squat in terms of power output and rate of force development. Again, this would have been done better elsewhere, but if you want to change rate of force development, then your Olympic lift or your more heavy concentric jump type activity is the way to go. Whereas if you want to develop peak power, your lighter, faster hex bar jump squat or barbell jump squat is the way to go. And then we compare barbell jump squat with hex bar jump squat, and because of the positioning of the bar, because of the positioning of the load in the hex bar jump squat, you can produce more power output in that than you would in the barbell jump squat. So that would be our go-to when we're trying to deal with peak power changes with lighter loads. If we want to do rate of force development, then that's when we look at an Olympic lift or concentric jump squat. If we want to look at strength, we just keep it pretty simple with some form of heavy squat. And then obviously your more high-end plyometric exercises, your fast reactive plyometric exercises, are going to change your reactive strength. So those are the main, and again, this is standard stuff along the force velocity curve, but for us we try and keep it pretty simple so that we're not just giving players exposure to a huge variety of exercises. Well, what's the quality that you want to develop? And looking at that, what's the best exercise to develop that quality? And we try and narrow our exercise selection a little bit to fit that, without going to the point of having too little variation in your program so that it becomes boring for players. But we get more variation, I think, generally through changing the type of stimulus as opposed to just the exercise a lot of the time, because we want to, you can go front squat 1 week, back squat next week, box squat next week with a pretty novice guy who's not strong enough, and all you're doing is probably adapting to the different exercises, when if your goal is to develop the capacity of peak force, should you not stick with the same exercise for that period of time and then progress and move on from there? So that's probably been the reason originally why we narrowed in our exercise selection, because we wanted to develop physical capacities that actually impact the game performance, and then a specificity in terms of the action comes through technical things that we try and develop in the game, which the rugby coaches do, and everything else in applying those capacities.
Yeah.
I don't know if that.
No, that definitely answers it, and it kind of leads on as you touch into when you change, or whether you change exercise or you change the kind of physical quality you're targeting. So how do you approach periodization? And it might be interesting to sort of compare how you did it with Leinster in the Pro 14 or Pro 12 as it might have been then, and the difference with the Premiership. Obviously the fixtures being different.
Yeah, I suppose to me the basis of the periodization to me is probably more down to where the player is as opposed to the game schedule in a lot of ways. So that we would do that jump squat profile, which is a pretty, again, ancient thing that's been around for a long time, but we just go that 20, 40, 60, 80, 100% load in the jump squat and check movement speed across those loads with a gym aware, and we'd know around about what those scores should look like in a really top level powerful player, and then trying to hone in that if a guy at 100% load doesn't have the power output that we want, it's probably a strength issue for that guy. If he does have those power levels or movement speed levels at 100% load but doesn't have it at 20 and 40, you're probably looking at more of a power output level power output issue or a rate of force development issue. So then that may change the type of programming that you do with that player. So we try and be, as much as we can now, more individualised with it instead of just applying it across the group relative to a fixture list as well. For this player right now, what is the quality that he needs to develop that's going to push him further down the track in terms of his S&C profile? And that jump squat profile, combined with your strength scores, your counter movement jump, your reactive strength stuff, gives you a decent overall snapshot of where a player is at to then go, this guy's not stronger, he needs to keep developing there, or his strength is pretty good now, but we want to target something else along the force velocity curve. So that would probably guide our periodization more at this stage than the schedule. Obviously, there's going to be times where if you have a 5-6 day turnaround between a couple of games, that you've got to lighten the load in whatever you're doing gym-wise, but we try and keep a player tracking along something that's relative to his individual priority the whole time. And that's probably our periodization, is to just track players periodically and go, what do they need next? And then try and map that out for a period of a few months, really.
Yeah, so you kind of figure out what they need, target that adaptation until, they've got some adaptation, and then you look at it again and see what they need. Does that make sense? That kind of the idea? Yeah.
Sometimes you go 2 or 3 months saying that they need to get stronger, and then you reassess it again and go, oh, they still need to get stronger, so let's keep going.
Yeah.
As long as those improvements are happening, then obviously you haven't hit any staleness in your programming, because they're continuing to develop. So
yeah,
we wouldn't just give players some high velocity movements just for the hell of it if it's actually not what they need, because in a lot of cases with that jump squat profile, what we would find was with a weak player, after a period of training, they'll actually improve at 20, 40, 60, 80 and 100% loads. So they're already developing power levels at those lower loads because they're getting stronger. So why would you need to go in and actually give them a 20, 30, 40% load in their training? Because they're actually adapting power-wise just from high loading.
Yeah.
So it's about being smart, really, about when you actually decide, right now it's time to develop power output or rate of force development in those guys. And, the other thing is that as our strength program's happening, your plyometric program's happening alongside it anyway.
Yeah.
So we tend to have a pretty balanced force velocity exposure a lot of the time anyway, because we're top and bottom end of that curve almost the whole time. So it's probably less and less over the last few years have we gone into that jump squat mode, because I'm going, you might get a little bit more peak power in a jump squat and you're doing a counter movement jump or a body weight exercise, but we are actually getting a lot of exposure to low load, high velocity jumps, and then we're loading them heavy, so we're actually getting a pretty balanced athlete at the end of it, which the information that we have would back up,
Yeah, definitely. And sort of moving on more to your kind of weekly sort of training periodization, how do you I know how you do it, but how do you talk about the high-low approach you've used in terms of training intensity, obviously including the rugby stuff as well?
Yeah, so I suppose from a pre-season planning point of view, we always it's a Charlie Francis model, really, of high central nervous system load followed by a lower load on alternating days, as much as is possible when you've got a mixed mixed energy system, mixed capacity sport. But our Mondays and Thursdays say in a week would typically be our speed, power, high load, really high stress central nervous system days, and then our conditioning days and upper limb days would be more the Tuesday, Friday days, with Wednesday being a kind of recovery day. So we would overload everything on the one day. On a Monday, your high load stuff, your high speed stuff, your reactive strength, your high powered activities. So big central nervous system stress. Next day, change to more of a metabolic stress, where you're not going to hit the same sort of central nervous system stress, but you will in terms of energy system and everything else. And that would be our standard pre-season practice. And then in terms of, I suppose, our exposure on the field, you're trying to marry that as much as you possibly can at different times. So having high and low days in terms of a high-speed running day or a contact day, where you're just changing the type of overload that you're getting in the gym and on the field, so that's you're not hammering on the same thing day on day, which I think could cause issues, and will obviously you're not going to get the same adaptation if you try and do, a high speed day Monday, high speed day Tuesday. You're not going to get the same benefit on the Tuesday as you would on the Monday. So why would you repeat it? Why not give yourself the 48 hours to 72 hours before you go again? So again, to me, it's just the Charlie Francis stuff. I think his general philosophy of training was brilliant, but it was just really, really logical that you can't hammer the same quality every day. It doesn't work. So hammer it, give it time to recover, and then hammer it again is the basic philosophy that we have, really.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into what you're saying with the strength qualities as well. You can't adapt to them all at the same time, so you've got to focus on what your big priority is, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So this is a question we ask all the guests on the podcast, and it's, what do you think is the biggest mistake rugby players make when it comes to strength and conditioning?
What's the biggest mistake they make when it comes to strength and conditioning? To be honest, probably those who don't probably adhere to the advice that we give them. So scientific information that we have on them. A lot of players have preconceived notions of what, not a lot of players, but some players would have notions themselves of what they need to develop, what qualities they need, without having the type of knowledge or experience that people who do our profession and do it for a long time would have. And sometimes I think where some players would fall down is if they go off at a tangent and think that they need to do X, Y, and Z without really getting hard, solid advice or thinking it through logically. And that's when some players can come a cropper from either overloading something that they don't need to, or developing qualities that may not be what's required for them. So, for example, it might be someone who has it in their head that hypertrophy is what they need for their game, when in actual fact the evidence we would say would be that, well, you actually need to be more powerful and you need to be quicker over 10 metres, and then them going off at the tangent to develop more lean tissue may not actually help that quality. So to me, that's probably the biggest mistake that players would make. Again, it's only a small fraction of them, but those would be the people who maybe we would see not adapting as we would like, the people who don't actually just take the advice on board and run with it, really.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we kind of touched on it a little bit, talking about periodization, but how have you found the difference, just, coaching in a different environment between, the Celtic League and the Premiership?
Yeah, it's been a challenge. The league is a real challenge in terms of how relentless it is, really. It's week on week. Every team is desperate to win. Relegation definitely from the top 6 and the top 4, all the permutations there do bring more meat and desperation to every week, no matter who you're playing, really, home or away. Both teams tend to be desperate to want to win the game. And that's a real challenge, and probably the difference for me would be, I suppose, Leinster had a different management system with the RFU and everything else, and you had a lot of players playing international rugby. So the challenge of managing that player is different to the challenge of here. It's much more about week in, week out for players, making sure that they're well recovered between games, that you're keeping a consistent stimulus for them. So yeah, there are different challenges, really, both good challenges, both enjoyable challenges. But certainly for me, the change and the challenge is what I wanted, and it's I've certainly come across a change and challenge, but it has been enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely, and of course you're up in Newcastle for game tonight. So you're cold and windy, I would imagine, and just sort of lurking in a hotel room in Newcastle on your own, which is a bit strange. But where can people learn more about you? I know you're on Twitter, but you don't really tweet, but you do have a lot of followers. I know you've told me that in the past.
I'm just a spy on Twitter, really. I don't tweet anything, so I don't know where you can find me, really. Come to Cheltenham if you want to meet me. But I'm not I'm not really a massive social media presence, I suppose, but I'm a nice guy to talk to, so if people go to Cheltenham, let me know.
I'll put your address on the website. Cheers, Dan. It's been great to talk to you. Thanks for sharing all that. I hope I haven't given away too many of your secrets in that, but really appreciate that. And all the best for the game tonight and the rest of the season.
No, thanks, Jamie. Thanks very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Great stuff. Thank you, Dan. Great insights into your work at Gloucester, and of course all the best for the rest of the season. Obviously currently doing very well. That's good to see. In the meantime, guys, keep subscribing to us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn or iTunes, and of course give us a 5-star review. And check us out at rugbyrenegade.com for our online subscription program, and get in touch with us through our social media channels for any questions you want featured on the podcast or on our YouTube videos. There's currently tons of videos in the archive there, and of course new videos coming out weekly. So check us out there and keep listening for more podcasts.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Renegade Podcast. For more quality rugby strength and conditioning information, check us out at rugbyrenegade.com. Rugby Renegade, building machines.